The conference room on the 34th floor had floor-to-ceiling glass on three sides, and on a clear Thursday afternoon in late October, you could see all the way to the river. Ellsworth Vane liked that. He had chosen the building partly for that reason. The sensation of elevation, of being above the grade where ordinary problems lived. The 7 people seated around the table with him understood that this was not a coincidence. They understood most things about Ellsworth Vane by reading the room he chose to be in. The weekly risk review had run 41 minutes. It always ran 41 minutes because Vane had decided years ago that 45 was too long, and 30 was a performance of efficiency rather than the real thing. 41 was specific enough to be intentional. The compliance team had learned to finish their sections at the right time. Everyone at that table had learned to finish things at the right time. The slide deck was on its last page, a summary graphic in Vane capitals navy and gray, a firm so old in its self-presentation that it had never felt the need to update its visual identity. When every screen in the room changed, not flickered, changed. Cleanly, simultaneously, as though someone had simply decided that the summary graphic was done. What replaced it was a photograph. The photograph showed a room that no one outside of 5 people in that building was supposed to know existed. It showed the vault anteroom on that same floor, the environmental control vestibule that preceded the main vault chamber, taken from a position inside the room, near the humidity gauge on the north wall. The angle was specific. The timestamp in the lower right corner read 9:14 a.m. That morning. Below the photograph, in clean sans serif type, centered on the screen. By midnight Saturday, the item on the 3rd shelf left side will leave this building exactly the way you acquired it. Cameras, guards, and compliance team included. The gentleman Ellsworth Vane looked at the screen for approximately 4 seconds. Then he looked at his head of security, a man named Curtis Prawl, who had spent 11 years at the NSA before Vane hired him away with a number that made the government salary feel like a rounding error. Prawl was already on his phone. His expression had not changed, which was either professionalism or something else. The look of a man who had just seen something he was going to need time to categorize. The 6 other people in the room were looking at Vane. He picked up his water glass, drank from it, and set it down. "Get the room," he said. It was not clear whether he meant get everyone out of the room or get control of the room or something else entirely. But everyone understood. They were gone in 40 seconds. Prawl stayed. "Who else has access to that floor's system?" Vane asked. "I'm working on that." "Work faster." Prawl reviewed the security footage for 6 hours that afternoon. Then he reviewed it again. The vault anteroom had 4 cameras, 2 mounted, 1 in the humidity system panel, 1 recessed above the environmental control unit. All 4 had been recording continuously since 6 a.m. The footage from 9:14 a.m. showed the anteroom empty. No person, no movement. The humidity gauge on the north wall was visible in 3 of the 4 feeds. The angle from which the photograph had been taken, the angle from inside the room near that gauge, would have required a person to be standing in a specific position for a period of time long enough to frame and capture that image. The footage showed no person. Prawl brought this to Vane at 9 p.m. He said it carefully, with the precision of someone who had spent a career translating impossible things into words that could be acted upon. He said the footage was clean. He said the timestamp was accurate. They had cross-referenced it with 3 independent system logs. He said the photograph, based on everything he could determine, should not exist. Vane listened. Then he said, "Double the rotation. Add a biometric layer. I want 2 bodies on that door every hour until Sunday morning." He paused. and find me whoever handles building security for the art conservation firm." Prahl wrote something on his phone. "Which one? Whichever one has access to this floor." There was only one. Before any of this happened, before the Thursday that Ellsworth Vane would later refer to in the rare private conversations he permitted himself about that period, as the Thursday, the gentleman had been inside the building twice. The first time was 7 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning in early September, when he had come as part of a two-person team from Linden Restoration Associates, a small firm that had held the building's art conservation contract for 4 years. Linden handled humidity-sensitive documents and archival materials for a roster of financial clients whose aesthetic self-presentation required them to hold original things, original letters, original certificates, original signed documents, in conditions that an ordinary office environment would destroy over time. The vault anteroom on the 34th floor of Vane Capital's building was one of 11 such spaces Linden serviced on a quarterly rotation. The gentleman had not come as himself. He had come as a conservator named David Marsh, which was not his name but was a name attached to a work history that Linden's HR system found entirely unremarkable when it was entered 14 weeks before that September morning. The resume showed 7 years at 2 other firms, references that answered when called, a certification from a program that had credentialed several hundred practitioners over its operating life. The interview had lasted 22 minutes. He had started the following week. He was, by every measure available to the people responsible for measuring such things, a conservator named David Marsh, who was quiet, competent, and showed no particular interest in the clients beyond what the work required. The second time he was inside the building was a Thursday in late September, 6 days before the risk review. He had come for a pre-visit assessment, a standard step before the quarterly inspection, used to confirm that the environmental systems had maintained their parameters and that no new materials had been introduced to the controlled spaces without proper logging. He had spent 40 minutes in the vault anteroom, moving methodically, checking readings, noting adjustments. He had positioned himself near the humidity gauge on the north wall for a specific period of time. Then he left. The quarterly inspection was scheduled for the first Saturday of November. It had been on the calendar since August. If you want to understand what Ellsworth Vane had built, not just in the vault and not just in the building, you have to go back to a Tuesday morning in the spring of 11 years earlier, when a man named Gerald Ossie walked into a conference room in the financial district and sat down across from someone he had been told was a partner at a consulting firm that advised institutional funds. The man across from him was not a partner at a consulting firm. He was a representative of Vane Capital, though that was not the name on the card he handed Ossie, and the nature of the conversation that followed had nothing to do with consulting. Gerald Ossie was at that time the trustee of the pension fund for a mid-size manufacturing union, Local 714 of the United Industrial Workers, covering roughly 8,400 active members and another 12,000 retirees across 4 states. He had been trustee for 9 years. He was, by most accounts, a careful man, not sophisticated in the way that financial professionals use that word, but careful. He read documents. He asked questions. He had, over 9 years, managed to keep the fund out of most of the arrangements that had quietly stripped other funds of the same size. What he had not been able to keep out of was the arrangement that brought him to that conference room on that Tuesday morning. The specifics of what happened in that room are not entirely recoverable, because the document that would have made them recoverable was the item on the 3rd shelf, left side of the vault on the 34th floor of Vane Capital's building. What is known? What the gentleman had assembled from 11 years of paper trails, from conversations with people who had been in adjacent rooms and adjacent situations, from documents that had made it into the public record before they were sealed, is the shape of what happened. Osei had discovered an irregularity in the fund's investment portfolio, not a small one. A series of positions in instruments that Vane Capital had structured and sold to the fund 3 years earlier. Instruments that had been represented as stable and were not. Instruments that had generated substantial fees for Vane Capital at the moment of sale and had subsequently lost value in a way that a careful reading of their construction would have predicted with reasonable confidence. The fund had lost $340 million over the course of those 3 years. The retirees were not yet aware of what this would mean for their payments. The active members were not aware at all. Osei had brought this to the attention of the fund's legal counsel. The legal counsel had brought it, quietly, through a channel that was supposed to be confidential, to the attention of a regulator. The regulator had begun a preliminary inquiry, and then Osei had been invited to a meeting. What happened in that meeting ended the preliminary inquiry. It ended it because Osei afterward signed a document, a promissory note, personal, for an amount that represented the entirety of his personal assets, and then some payable on demand to an entity connected to Vane Capital. And that document, once signed, meant that any testimony Osei gave in any proceeding would be colored by the question of what he stood to lose if he gave it. It meant that the regulator, when they eventually learned of the note's existence, found a witness whose credibility had been permanently compromised. It meant that the $340 million stayed where it had gone. Osei had signed because he had been told, in language that was careful and specific and entirely deniable, what would happen to his family if he didn't. The preliminary inquiry closed 18 months later for insufficient evidence. The promissory note lived on the third shelf left side of the vault on the 34th floor. The gentleman had learned about Gerald Osei from a woman named Denise Patterson, who was Osei's youngest sister, and who worked as an administrative coordinator at a nonprofit that helped workers navigate pension disputes. She had not come to the gentleman looking for help. She had come to a meeting about a different fund dispute, a different company, a different state, and the gentleman had been present at that meeting in a different capacity entirely, one of the social roles he moved through without anyone thinking to question. He had listened to her talk about her brother with the particular cadence of someone who had carried a piece of information for a long time without knowing where to put it. He had not introduced himself that day. He had not said anything about what he understood. He had filed it. 3 weeks later, he had begun working at Linden Restoration Associates. It's worth asking yourself what you would have done with that information. Not the information about the vault, not the information about the plan, the information about Gerald Osei, a man in his late 60s now, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood in Cleveland. That had been something else when he moved there and was something else again now. A man who had not, by any account that the gentleman could find, done another dishonest thing in the 11 years since that Tuesday morning in the financial district, who had resigned as trustee 18 months after the meeting, citing health reasons that were not entirely false, who called his sister twice a week and talked about his grandchildren and did not, as far as anyone could tell, talk about the conference room. What do you do with something like that? When you know, and you can't prove it, and the person who could prove it has been made into someone whose proof wouldn't be believed? The gentleman had learned, over the course of his particular career, that there was one answer to that question, and it wasn't the one most people gave. Most people said, you go to the authorities, or you find a journalist, or you let it go, because the world is full of Gerald Osei's and you cannot carry all of them. The gentleman had tried the first two and found them useful sometimes for certain kinds of problems. He had never managed the third. What he did instead was go to work. The quarterly inspection was scheduled for 9 a.m. on Saturday, November 4th. Vane spent Friday night in the building. This was not a decision he announced. He told his assistant he had a dinner at the club and would be late. The dinner was real. It ran until 10:30, and afterward, instead of taking the car to his apartment on the Upper East Side, he went back to the building and rode the elevator to the 34th floor and sat in his office and watched the security feed from the vault anteroom on the monitor that Prahl had installed for exactly this purpose on Thursday afternoon. The feed was live. The resolution was good. The two guards stationed outside the vault door were visible in the lower left quadrant of the frame, changing positions on the hour. He did not sleep. At 6:45 a.m. on Saturday, he called Prahl. "Nothing," Prahl said, before Vane asked. "The conservators come at 9. I know. We have the file on both of them. Marsh has been with Linden for 14 weeks. The other one, Yolanda Ferris, has been with them 4 years. Background checks clean on both. I want someone in the room the entire time they're on the floor. Already planned. Someone senior. I'll be there myself." Vane looked at the monitor. The guards had just switched positions. Everything was where it was supposed to be. "He's not getting in," he said. Prahl said, "No." The thing about Curtis Prahl was that he was genuinely good at his job, not good in the way that the people who worked for him were good, competent, trained, following procedures, but good in the way that meant he understood problems before they fully articulated themselves. He had spent 11 years at an agency that rewarded exactly that quality, and he had carried it into private work and applied it with the same discipline. When he said things were handled, they were generally handled. He had reviewed the Linden contract files on Thursday night. He had verified that the quarterly inspection had been on the calendar since August, and he had noted this as the kind of detail that required attention, the kind of scheduling that could be either entirely innocent or not. He had pulled David Marsh's employment records and found nothing that raised a flag, which he noted did not mean there was nothing to find, only that he hadn't found it. He had also done something that was not in the standard protocol, something that his training had made reflexive. He had arranged for the biometric upgrade, the third layer Vane had ordered, to be completed before the conservators arrived Saturday morning rather than after. He had scheduled the installation for 6 a.m. The technician arrived at 5:55. The installation took 83 minutes. During those 83 minutes, the vault's motion detection system operated on its backup loop, a known limitation of the upgrade process, one that the building's security documentation listed clearly and that Prahl had read and accounted for. He had placed both guards physically inside the anteroom for the duration of the recalibration window, standing, visible, watching. The gentleman knew about the backup loop. He had learned about it in the third week of September during the pre-visit assessment when he spent 40 minutes in the anteroom and used 22 of them reviewing the environmental systems maintenance documentation, a binder kept on a shelf near the humidity gauge, updated quarterly, containing the technical specifications for every piece of equipment in the room, including the security integration notes that explained how each system behaved during a maintenance event. He had not taken the binder. He had read 7 pages of it and replaced it exactly where he found it. He had also learned something else during those 40 minutes, something that was not in any document. The way the anteroom's ventilation system cycled, the specific pressure differential it created between the anteroom and the hallway outside when the main vault door was sealed, and the effect that differential had on the gap between the anteroom door's frame and its seal at the upper left corner, a gap that was 3 millimeters on ordinary days and became something slightly different on days when the system was working at capacity. which it always was when outside temperature dropped below 50 degrees. He had not recorded this observation anywhere. The morning of Saturday, November 4th, was 38 degrees. David Marsh and Yolanda Ferris arrived at the building's service entrance at 8:52 a.m., which was standard for a Linden team. They built in time for the building's check-in process. The guard at the service entrance verified their credentials against the approved visitor list, confirmed their equipment cases against the manifest Linden had filed with building management 2 weeks earlier, and issued them both temporary access badges that worked on the freight elevator and on the 34th floor's secondary entrance. Curtis Prohl met them at the elevator. He was professional and not unfriendly. He explained that given the building's security protocols, he would be accompanying them throughout the inspection and that a second staff member would be present in the anteroom at all times. He did not explain the reason for the elevated attention, and they did not ask, which he found either unremarkable or slightly remarkable, depending on the frame he put around it. Yolanda Ferris said, "Of course, we appreciate the access support." She had been doing this for 4 years. She was untroubled by building security personnel. She had found over the course of her career that the buildings with the most security were also the buildings most confident, that their security made them safe, and that this confidence made them in certain specific ways easier to work in than buildings that relied on human attention rather than systems. Marsh said nothing. He was carrying the larger of the 2 equipment cases, the one with the humidity calibration tools and the archival supplies, and his attention appeared to be on navigating the case through the elevator doors without catching the corner on the frame. Prohl watched him. The inspection of the anteroom took 1 hour and 14 minutes. Both conservators worked. Prohl and a second guard named Kevin Stroud stood near the door. Prohl watched everything. He watched the way Marsh moved through the room, the sequence in which he checked the equipment, the moments when his body blocked the line of sight to a particular area of the room. He watched the way Ferris worked on the opposite side, methodical, unhurried. Nothing happened. At 10:11 a.m., Marsh and Ferris packed their cases, confirmed their work log with Prohl, and were escorted back to the freight elevator. Their access badges were collected at the service entrance. The guard logged them out at 10:18. Prohl went back to the 34th floor and checked the vault door, sealed. Both biometric readers green. He checked the anteroom, everything in its place. He went to the monitor room and reviewed the last 90 minutes of footage. Clear. He called Vane at 10:24. "They're gone," he said. "Clean." There was a pause on the line. "Check the vault," Vane said. Check inside the vault." Prohl looked at the screen. The vault door was sealed. Both biometric readers were green. The motion sensors, fully recalibrated now, showed nothing. He said, "I'll need your authorization for the second key. I'm downstairs. I'll be up in 4 minutes." Vane arrived at 10:29. He and Prohl stood at the vault door together and completed the dual authorization sequence, biometrics, keys, a 6-digit code. The door opened. The environmental seal released with a sound like a held breath finally let go. The vault was a room approximately 12 feet by 14, with climate-controlled shelving on 3 walls and a small examination table in the center. The shelving was organized by acquisition date. Each item had a numbered tag, logged in a proprietary system that only Vane and 2 others had access to. Vane walked to the 3rd shelf on the left side. He stood there for a moment. The item that had been on that shelf, a sealed archival sleeve containing a single document, a promissory note on personal stationery, signed in blue ink, witnessed by a notary whose seal was still crisp after 11 years, was not there. In its place was a document. A single printed page, on paper that looked like it had come from an ordinary office printer, in a protective sleeve identical to the one that had been removed. Vane picked it up. It was a complaint. A formal complaint bearing a case number and a filing date from 11 years ago. The complaint that Gerald Osei's attorney had submitted to the regulatory body before the preliminary inquiry. The complaint that had described the fund losses, the structured products, the fees, the timeline. A complaint that had been sealed as part of a proceeding that was later closed. A complaint that should not have been in anyone's possession outside of the parties to that proceeding. At the bottom of the page, in clean typeset, below the final paragraph of the complaint, filed. Vane read the page once, then he read it again. The room was quiet. The environmental system hummed at its calibrated frequency. Prahl stood near the door and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because he understood, with the professional clarity of someone whose entire career had been built on understanding how things failed, that he was looking at the result of something he had not been able to see. The photograph, the recalibration window, the inspection schedule that had been on the calendar since August, the equipment cases that had cleared the manifest check, the equipment cases. He thought about the equipment case, the larger one, the one Marsh had been navigating through the elevator door. He would spend the next 4 days reviewing footage and access logs and trying to reconstruct the mechanism. He would find things that suggested a sequence and no thing that confirmed one. He would eventually produce a report that described the outcome with precision and the method with uncertainty, which was the most honest document he had written in a long time. Vane did not read the report. He put it in a drawer. What Vane understood, standing in the vault with the complaint in his hand, was not the mechanics. It was the message. Someone had been inside this room, had been inside it in a way that his 9 cameras and his dual authorization system and his recalibrated biometric readers had not caught, in a way that his 6 hours of footage review and his 4 days of subsequent analysis could not fully explain, and had taken the one document that held a specific weight over a specific man, and had left in its place the document that weight had been used to suppress. He could not call the police. The promissory note's existence and the manner of its acquisition was not a thing he could describe to a law enforcement officer without describing other things. He could not call his lawyers for the same reason. He could not tell the story of what had been taken without telling the story of why he'd had it. The complaint now was somewhere he did not control. It was in someone else's hands, or it was going to be. And it described, in the dry procedural language of a regulatory filing, events that had cost 8,400 active union members and 12,000 retirees $340 million, and it named Vane Capital in 8 of its 11 paragraphs. What he could not do about it was the most precise thing in the room. Gerald Osei received a letter on a Monday morning, 6 days later. It was not from a lawyer, and it was not from a government agency, and it did not contain legal language. It was handwritten, 2 paragraphs, and it said that the document that had made him a compromised witness in a proceeding he had tried to pursue honestly no longer existed in the form that had compromised him. It said that a copy of the original complaint had been placed with a journalist whose track record on financial fraud cases suggested she would know what to do with it. It said that whatever he decided to do next was entirely his own decision, and that he owed nothing to anyone for what had happened. It was not signed. Osei read it at his kitchen table in the 2-bedroom apartment in Cleveland on a Monday morning in November when the temperature had dropped overnight, and his granddaughter was visiting and was making noise in the back room with a toy that made electronic sounds. He read it twice. Then he folded it and held it and sat there for a while. His sister Denise called him that afternoon, as she did twice a week. He told her he was fine. She said he sounded different, and he said he didn't know what she meant. She said she thought she did. He didn't argue. He made a decision by the end of that week. He called a lawyer. Not the one from 11 years ago, a different one, younger. Someone who had been recommended by a colleague who had worked on fund cases. And he made an appointment, and he went, and he sat across from her and said, "I have something to tell you." The journalist, a woman named Priya Subramaniam, who had spent 6 years covering financial regulation for a publication whose readership included most of the people who ran the institutions she wrote about, received the complaint by courier on a Wednesday. She spent 2 days verifying its provenance. On the 3rd day, she called 3 sources she trusted. On the 4th day, she began making calls to Vane Capital's communications office that went unreturned for a week, and then received a response from outside counsel that said, in careful language, that the firm had no comment. The story ran on a Sunday in December. The gentleman was not in New York when it ran. He had finished the work that required him to be in New York some weeks earlier, and he had moved on to other things as he always did, other buildings, other calendars, other scheduled visits that appeared unremarkable until they were over. He read the story on his phone in the morning in a city that was not New York, over coffee that was better than he'd expected. He did not feel the thing that people sometimes expected him to feel at moments like this. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not the clean resolution that stories about people like him were supposed to end with. What he felt was closer to something quieter. The particular stillness of a thing that had been put where it belonged after being in the wrong place for a long time. He thought about Gerald Ossie sitting at his kitchen table. He thought about 11 years of carrying something that heavy and still calling his sister twice a week. He thought about the specific quality of courage that didn't announce itself, that didn't have a name, that just kept showing up to the same Tuesday morning and the same 2-bedroom apartment and the same grandchildren making noise in the back room. The gentleman had rules he didn't negotiate, not because they made him righteous. They didn't. And he had no interest in righteous, but because without them, what he was doing was just a different version of what the other side was doing, dressed better. The rules were what made the difference between precision and cruelty. He had known when he filed Osei away in September that he was going to have to be careful, not careful in the way that the security team at Vane Capital had been careful, systems, protocols, biometrics, but careful in the way that meant every decision in the chain connected back to something he could defend to himself at the end. He could defend all of them. He thought about Prawl. He found, when he thought about Curtis Prawl, something that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it. The recognition of someone who had done the job correctly, who had seen most of what there was to see, who had simply been working with a variable he couldn't account for. The recalibration window, 83 minutes. Prawl had put 2 guards in the anteroom for that window, which was the right call, the call that anyone in his position should have made. It just wasn't the right room. There were things about what had happened that Prawl would never fully reconstruct. The gentleman did not think this was a failure of Prawl's intelligence. It was a feature of the situation. Some mechanisms were not meant to be recovered. A magician who explains the trick is not a magician. He's just a person standing next to a box. What the gentleman had used and what he would not describe, and what Prawl's report circled without landing on, was connected to the equipment case and to the ventilation pressure differential and to the 18-minute period between 6:47 and 7:05 a.m. on Saturday morning when the backup motion loop was active and the guards were standing in the anteroom watching the room they were standing in, and to a set of decisions that had been made in a specific sequence over the course of 14 weeks, beginning with a resume submitted to Linden Restoration Associates in late July, and ending with an equipment case navigated through an elevator door with apparent difficulty. The apparent part was the part. He finished his coffee. The story was already circulating. He could see it in the reshare numbers, in the response from accounts that tracked financial regulation, in a statement that Vane Capital's outside counsel had posted late Sunday morning that said the firm was aware of the matter and had no further comment at this time. He put his phone down and looked out the window at a city going about its Sunday. He thought about the calling card. He always thought about the calling card afterward, not with pride, not with the particular pleasure of the flourish, but as a point of professional review. Was it right? Was it proportionate? Did it say what it was meant to say? A filed complaint. That was all. A document that had been suppressed returned to the world in the form it had originally taken. An allegation, a case number, a set of names, a timeline, left in the sleeve where the instrument of suppression had been. The bureaucratic language of accountability placed where the private instrument of coercion had lived for 11 years. He thought it was right. The code he operated by was not complicated, but it had costs, and the costs were real, and he had paid them. 14 weeks of a life in a role that was not his. 40 minutes in a room reading a maintenance manual. An 83-minute window that required everything to have been arranged beforehand, with no room for adjustment in the moment, because adjustment in the moment was how people got caught, and how plans became something other than plans. The vault's dual key authorization requirement had meant that the document could not be removed at a moment of his choosing. It had to be removed at a moment the vault was open, which meant a moment the vault was being inspected, which meant a moment that had been on the calendar since August and could not be moved. He had not moved it. He had used it. The discipline of that. The particular discipline of arranging something weeks in advance and then not adjusting it, of trusting a structure you built before you knew all the variables, was the discipline he had come to think of as the real work. The vault, the biometrics, the guards. Those were obstacles. The real work was in the planning before the obstacles existed, in the moment when you had to decide what you believed the adversary would do when warned, and then build your plan around the version of them you understood rather than the version you hoped for. He had understood Vane correctly. Vane had added the biometric layer. Vane had scheduled the installation for Saturday morning. Vane had done exactly what a careful, security-conscious person would do when warned that something was going to happen. He had added a system, and the system had required a recalibration, and the recalibration had a window, and the window was the plan, not a gap. A window. There's a difference. A gap is something the adversary forgot about. A window is something they built. Outside, the city was November gray and functional, the specific visual frequency of a place that had things to do and was doing them. The gentleman had things to do and would do them. There was always something next. Another room, another calendar, another person in a kitchen somewhere reading a letter they hadn't expected. He thought about Denise Patterson, who would learn in the weeks after the story ran what had happened. Not the mechanics of it, not the how, but the what, the shape of the outcome. She would learn that her brother had found a lawyer, that the complaint had surfaced, that an investigation that had been closed for a decade had been reopened under circumstances that a regulator's statement would describe as new and significant evidence. She would learn this in stages, as these things always unfolded in stages, and she would probably not connect all of it back to a meeting she had attended about a different fund in a different state, where a man she didn't particularly notice had listened carefully and said nothing. That was fine. It was better than fine. The best outcomes were the ones that felt inevitable from the inside, like the world had simply corrected, like the thing that had been wrong had found its way back to right through some natural process that nobody needed to explain. He was not the explanation. He was the mechanism. And mechanisms, by their nature, were meant to be invisible once they'd done their work. He paid for the coffee and left a tip that was more than the coffee cost, because that was another rule, small and constant, and he kept his rules. If you stayed with this story to the end, you earned the question it leaves you with, not as a lesson, because this isn't that kind of story, but as the thing the gentleman would have thought about if he'd been willing to think out loud, which he generally wasn't. Ellsworth Vane built the most defended room he could build, hired the sharpest security mind he could hire, stayed in the building all night, and watched everything. He just watched it from the wrong direction. He watched for a threat from outside his system, and the mechanism was already inside it, had been inside it since August, since a resume was submitted, since a maintenance binder was read and replaced on a shelf. That's the thing about certainty. It doesn't make you safe. It makes you predictable. And predictable, to someone who's been watching long enough, is the most dangerous thing you can be. The document on the third shelf, left side, is in the hands of people who know what to do with it. The promissory note that silenced Gerald Osei for 11 years is gone in a way that cannot be undone. And Curtis Prawl, who is genuinely good at his job, will spend a long time thinking about an equipment case and a ventilation differential and an 83-minute window, and he will get very close, and he will not quite arrive. That's the part that stays with you. Not the vault, not the biometrics, not the Thursday slide that should have been impossible. The part that stays is the patience. 14 weeks of a life, quietly arranged, moving pieces that didn't reveal their purpose until they were already in position, doing the work before the work was visible, trusting the plan you built before you knew all the variables, because if you've read the adversary correctly, you don't need to know all the variables. You just need to know them. If this story found you, it's because you stayed for the whole thing. The setup, the doubt, the moment where you thought maybe this time it doesn't work. If you want more of this, more rooms, more calendars, more plans built before anyone knew a plan was being built, you know what to do, like this one. Subscribe to the channel. And when you're done with both of those things, sit with this. If someone warned you in your own conference room, on your own screens with a timestamp from that same morning, and you had 6 days to prepare and you put everything you had into stopping it, and it still happened exactly as promised. What does that tell you about the difference between security and certainty? And what in your own life are you defending with systems, when what you actually need is to understand the person you're defending against? Take your time with that one. The gentleman already has.